Now, if people leave the gospel, I'd rather it be for a legitimate reason than some bullshit deception reason. And there's a lot of deception that goes around on the internet, goes around on TikTok, that if you actually do some digging, read some books, and God forbid, look at primary sources, it actually goes and falls away. So this episode, I'm dealing with the famous theory that you find on the internet, that you find on TikTok, that was Christ, my Messiah, based on a pagan myth, based on a pagan construct. That's what this video, that's what the Sabbath class is going to be dedicated to about. We're going to get right into it. Now, having studied this for some time and taken some notes and seeing different resources, you actually see that most of the parallels are bullshit. Simply said, bluntly said, that's what it is. Why? Because when it comes to this whole thing about Christ being copied from other gods, what we have to look at are the primary ancient sources, meaning the primary sources to these other people's religions, in the same way the Bible is our primary source for our religion, for the truth of God and for the revelation of the gospel, right? What did the primary sources in the time of Christ actually say? When you look at those, we'll see that most of the objections either disappear, because a lot of these things just can't be found in any ancient source, or the parallels that actually are found, because there are legitimate parallels, actually post-date Christ. Let me give you an example. The story about how the Greek god Dionysus turned water into wine. That is true in the historical record, but this post-dates the New Testament. I believe this is either 2nd century or 3rd century. I don't remember the exact. Inspiring Philosophy did a great series, and recently another video was dropped where he gave a presentation where he actually talked about each god one by one. I have no interest to do that here outside of Dionysus. If y'all are actually curious about each god on an individual basis, I encourage you to look at those videos. I'll link them in the description. But this video is mainly about historical principles that we should all adopt in having this conversation. Because I'm all for having this conversation. I'm all for looking at nuances and this and that. But we got to keep our mind in check when we do. All right. Back to Dionysus. 2nd century or 3rd century is the notion that he turned water into wine. Now, that's way after the time of Christ, meaning in the historical record, Christ was the first one to turn water into wine, and this Greek god came after. See, the same people that try to say that the New Testament borrowed from pagan myths, these are the facts that they'll leave out. So when you look at to the primary contemporary sources, we'll see that a lot of it is fluff that comes from either similarities that post-date the gospel, post-date the New Testament, either don't exist, period, when we actually look at the original sources, and also just a lot of stuff that's too generalized. For example, people try to argue that the New Testament took from pagan myths when Christ did miracles, just in a general sense. Well, every religion, every human spiritual belief system is going to have their gods and their prophets do miracles. What you got to do is empirically test them, right? But if religion A has person doing miracles, if religion B has person doing miracles, that's not enough to say person A stole from person B, or even person B stole from person A. You know what I'm saying? It's not enough to go either way. So just using miracles to try to argue copying is really flawed when they're trying to be as meticulous with history as possible. All right, so we got a lot of the similarities are way too generalized and don't count for anything. Some of the similarities just don't exist in the actual sources, and some of the similarities actually post-date the gospel and when the gospel spread across the empire. Now, with that being said, what you can try to argue is that before the pagan stuff was written, there was oral traditions that preceded it. All right, but the burden of proof would be on you to say, all right, there's this pagan tradition that would have been known to the apostles, and not just known to the apostles, but you have to prove causal intent for them to use it. Why is that? This gets into, I believe, a framework that God has given me to deal with this conversation, a new framework shift to shift the nature of the debate and the nature of the discussion that I'm going to get into a little bit later. The apostles, the writers of the New Testament, were all Israelites, ancient Israelites. And we're going to circle back to that a little bit later on. So the burden of proof for the person arguing this would be that any oral tradition of a pagan god would both be known to the apostles, but you'd have to actually provide evidence of intention to use that and apply it to Christ. The burden of proof is on you to make that point, make the argument. We don't have any evidence in the ancient world that points in that direction. I'm going to cover that a little bit later. That's the nature of this discussion. John 1:47, a beautiful verse in the Bible. God talks about how one of the apostles is an Israelite indeed. I'm quoting that to show you that how Hebraic the New Testament is. This I now realize is one of the greatest focuses of my channel and my ministry, as I hesitantly use that word. I don't want to use that word, but in terms of my goal, as it relates to, I think, I want to say the church as a whole, but especially within my community, I really think we really need to get into the Hebraic root of our beliefs and our traditions. I think that would have a lot of unity in the black community and black religions when they understand the Hebraic root, to better understand what people believe. And I'll talk more about that some other time. But the Hebraic root, like meaning the cultural context of the ancient Israelites in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, that one of the greatest things we can do in our faith journeys, in my opinion, is getting in touch with that. All right? So when we get in touch with that, in the case of the New Testament, we're dealing with the culture of ancient Israelites. The New Testament is so Hebraic that it represents better Jewish thinking than modern forms of rabbinic Talmudic Judaism. Because when you look at the history of Jewish thought, we actually see times a couple of decades after the temple was destroyed, about 3 decades after the temple was destroyed, where we can sort of track when rabbis changed their doctrinal positions and doctrinal ideas. So the nature of God, which was complex, a fact recognized by the ancient Israelites, that was changed in about 100 CE. So we have all the positive stuff, all the things left behind, such as Targums, Dead Sea Scrolls, the works of Jewish theologians and poets in the Israelite diaspora, to get a glimpse of the cultural atmosphere of the ancient Jews. All right, the first audience of the entire Old Testament, right? Their types of thinking, we can look and see these records that the Most High God has preserved for us to look at, all right, to get a glimpse of what they believe. Not only do we have that, we have the points where the rabbis actually began to change some of this stuff. And we don't realize how much in our own communities, our foundational presupposition, our foundational understanding is really rabbinic in nature. I think there can be a lot more unity and a lot more progress if we get in touch with the Hebraic thinking as opposed to the rabbinic thinking. A lot of us don't realize how much this type of rabbinic stuff has become a foundational presupposition in our communities. Right? I digress a little bit. All this is to show how Hebraic the New Testament is, to the point where we don't even realize how Hebraic it is, because a lot of that Hebraic stuff has been lost through history. Not lost because God has preserved these records, but lost in terms of day-to-day life, where we don't realize what the Israelite diaspora believed. Why is this so important? Because we're dealing with the very Hebraic, very ancient Israelite culture with the New Testament. The apostles, the early Christians, they were all Israelites. They were all among the tribes of Israel. And then the message spread to the Gentile nations and to the Gentile kingdoms. All right? So when we're dealing with ancient Israelites, we really have to ask ourselves, would these guys, would these cats honestly take pagan motifs, pagan parallels, and use them for Christ? Now, this brings us into the realm of theological messaging, which is basically a fancy way of saying concepts, beliefs, ideas that would have been important to the apostles and to the tribes of Israel during this time. These types of concepts and messages that give us a glimpse into how they thought, that are used to portray Christ, right? We're talking about Israelites trying to evangelize to other Israelites, which is one of the forgotten messages of the New Testament. These are apostles who are so strongly convinced that the Messiah has come that they want to let the other tribes of Israel know that the Messiah had come. All right, so we have all this type of Second Temple thinking, Book of Enoch thinking in the New Testament, which is the culture that all the apostles would have grown up in. So when we're getting into them of theological messaging, meaning using theological concepts and ideas that everybody would have recognized, and seeing how Christ is in that from the apostles' perspectives, when we understand that, we got to ask ourselves, would these guys really use pagan concepts and try to preach to other Israelites with that? That seems extremely unlikely. Here's the thing, the Israelite communities, they were biased against Gentiles, even beyond the bounds that were allowed by the Torah. What do I mean? Outside of any commandments against, any commandments that deal with any of the nations, we have them having a disdain for other nations, even having a prejudice against mixed race Jews. like with the Samaritans. And we have traces that ancient authors, other cultures actually picked up on this, and they didn't really like the Jews like that because they picked up on this hostility. All right. We also have examples from the works of, like, I believe Tacitus and Josephus, ancient historians, that show how zealous the Jews were as a community for their God, for Yahweh, or as some of my Israelite brothers were inclined to say, Yahweh. They were so zealous they would rather die than serve a pagan god, or they would rather have their necks cut rather than see a pagan image within the temple of the Most High God. This is the community. Not only do we see them to their own shame biased against Gentiles when it goes too far, but also being so zealous against idolatry and for their own God that they're willing to die to keep the faith pure. All right. So when we get to the followers of Christ, we're getting to a subset of this community who has the same zeal against idols. We see this in multiple places in the New Testament, like in 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 10, Book of Revelation, Book of 1 or 2 John. Christ himself teachings in Matthew 4, being firmly against idolatry, worshiping any other God. The Messianics are as zealous, maybe even more zealous in this message than the original Israelites. All right, this is something they inherited and fully uphold. So not only do we have the same zeal against idols and idolatry and paganism, but to the own shame of the apostles, we see them be biased against Gentiles in places like Acts 10 or Galatians 2, where they could get caught up in their own traditions that they don't want to look a certain way in front of their other Israelites, so they don't want to associate with Gentiles. Or they have this idea that going into a Gentile's house makes them unclean when that's not in the Torah to begin with. All right, so there's other traditions that we see working in the minds of the apostles to their own shame, right? Meaning they inherited these cultural beliefs that were actually found in the scriptures. So when we understand that, the same thing that we can find in the culture as a whole, we can find in the New Testament. Is examining the New Testament and examining the culture of the New Testament gives us the exact opposite of what we would expect, with the idea that this is a culture that would use pagan motifs to further advance their message of Christ. This is from, again, the abundance of internal and external evidence, because the followers of the way were a subset of the Israelite community that believed the Messiah had come. And we can see their zeal for the exclusive worship of Yahweh throughout their own texts, the New Testament, as we call it, and even to their own shame, types of behaviors and biases against Gentiles that aren't necessarily cosign, but reflect the time and place they're living in. So it's really unlikely that the same group of people, how zealous the Jews were for their the pure faith and how zealous they were against idolatry, that these same guys would use pagan motifs to begin with. Here's the silver bullet, though. Here's the silver bullet. Here's the silver bullet. That bullet is mad silver. What is it? Even if they did use pagan motifs, even if they did use pagan parallels to exemplify Christ, it would be an extension of what we already see in the Bible to begin with. It'd be an extension of what they were already doing to begin with. I'm going to explain to you why. All right, we see it all throughout the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, where the saints and the apostles and the writers of the Bible, they would actually take pagan concepts and repurpose them for the one true God. Why is that? We take for granted how much the world has been transformed through Christ, but we got to understand, for most of ancient history, even after the time of Christ, in his generation, and especially beforehand, we take it for granted how much pagan the world used to actually be. And we can see the explosion, how much that transformed through Christ, which is prophetic. But we see how pagan the nations were, and one of the things Israelites would do is they would say, all right, y'all believe such and such about this God. Y'all believe that Baal is the cloud rider. We're here to tell you that Yahweh is the actual cloud rider. The Most High God, whose name is represented on my hat. He is truly the one who rides the clouds. So it's not that they were pagan, but there is an art, there is a practice among the saints throughout all of biblical history where they would take pagan things and repurpose them for the one true God. So that's why, that's one of the attitudes I have that we don't realize. The saints have the right to take pagan things and repurpose them for the one true God, because that is separate than participating in paganism, as we can see from the Bible. We even see Acts 17, the Apostle Paul, I believe in Thessalonica or Mars Hill. He actually takes pagan poets, stuff about Zeus and other gods. He quotes them to the Greeks, and he takes what the poets wrote and applies it to the God of the Israelites. So this is something we even see the apostles do. They take pagan stuff, pagan work, pagan concepts that were wrongly applied to false gods and say, nah, y'all are wrong. This is really about the Most High God that we're proclaiming to you. So if they are taking pagan motifs and pagan parallels to show Christ, the most they would be doing is saying, all right, y'all have this tradition, y'all have this belief about this pagan God. We're here to show you that it's really Christ who rides the clouds. It's really Christ who has control of this, that, and the third. You see what I'm saying? So even if they did use pagan parallels, it'd be a continuation of what the saints have always been doing, in that they would take pagan stuff of the neighbors around them and use it to show them who the true God actually was. So if there are legitimate pagan parallels to Christ, and you can prove causation, because that's the burden of proof on you. You just establishing that there is pagan parallels that are actually from the time of Christ, that alone is not enough. You have to prove causation, that the apostles and New Testament writers would actually use this, because it's very unlikely that they would, given the culture they came from. All right? Correlation is not causation, meaning I might have a parallel to this person. That doesn't mean I stole from them or they stole from me. You have to actually have evidence to show that that causation, that borrowing, that type of thing going on is the case. Even if I said to you that's what happened, that you can prove there are legitimate parallels, and going to the time of Christ that don't come after, that the apostles would have been aware of it and they actually use it to advance the message of Christ, to portray Christ. The most they would be doing is acknowledging motifs in the ancient world and using them to show who Christ really is. How do I know that? Because they genuinely believed in the Hebraic Israelite Messiah from the very beginning. They actually genuinely believed in him and his resurrection from the very beginning. See, the thing is, with history, you can't be a Texas sharpshooter, which is a very common fallacy, meaning you can't just cherry pick evidence. You can't look at the ways all these parallels are similar and ignore all the ways that they're different. In other words, you have to be as objective and as nuanced as possible with the whole picture. So when you look at the whole picture in the New Testament, look at all the places where there's theological messaging in a very Hebraic sense, meaning a Hebraic theological messaging to show the tribes who Christ is. We have to take that in light of everything else, in light of the fact that the original Christians genuinely believed he actually resurrected, which we can prove historically. This is the center of the movement from the very beginning. So all types of messaging or theological concepts, mythological concepts that the apostles may use must be understood in the light and in the lens of the legitimate belief they had in the Hebrew Messiah from the very beginning, if that makes sense. How do we know this? Well, the Gospels themselves, the biographies of Jesus, there are a lot of internal things that actually show how they're internally reliable, things that have been noticed and picked up by other scholars. One of those things is called embarrassing details. There are things in the Gospels, especially during the Passion and resurrection narratives, that show how authentic the testimony is, because they're basing it on facts that would have been very hostile to the environments that they were preaching in. All right, for example, the fact that women in ancient Hebrew society who are not necessarily seen as reliable or as having reliable testimony, that they would be the first witnesses to Christ's resurrection it's a beautiful thing in hindsight, but at the time that is not something you would have made up. That's a very embarrassing movement to base your proclamation on, because we even see as time goes on, Christians are actually made fun of themselves because witnesses were the first ones who witnessed it. So this is an embarrassing thing in the world that the first apostles and later the earliest Christians came from. All right. The fact that the tomb Jesus gets placed in is from Joseph of Arimathea, who was from the Sanhedrin. The same Jewish party that actually killed the Messiah now has one of its members bury him. Well, all the actual apostles are nowhere to be found. So the original apostles, the men of God as they're supposed to be, they're nowhere to be found. The women were the first witnesses, and their testimony was seen as unreliable in that society. And this man from the party that just killed Christ is the one who shows up and all the apostles are gone and puts him in burial. So we look at these different things, and there's a reason now why the majority of biblical scholars actually accept the empty tomb of Christ and the resurrection appearances of Christ. Most scholars, even if they're not Christian, believe that these things actually happened, or that the apostles genuinely believed Christ had risen, and that they genuinely believed that he had resurrected, that the woman found his tomb empty. According to William Lane Craig and even Gary Habermas, there are foundational facts that we can look at as a foundation in terms of what scholars see, just to start the conversation with. All right, so that's the Gospels. We also have 1 Corinthians 15, a beautiful verse that demonstrates the gospel. Verses 3 to 7 show a creed that was in place at the very beginning of the church in Jerusalem, the assembly in Jerusalem, because later the Apostle Paul receives it, meaning it was in place before he had it. In other words, while the Apostle Paul was still persecuting the church, they had the belief that Christ had already died, been buried, and had resurrected. That was something in place from the earliest Hebrew saints before the Apostle Paul ever came in the picture. Not only is that a silver bullet towards the actual buried tomb of Christ, because of how early that goes back, that creedal information goes back to, that the earliest Christians actually believed this, but it also shows the belief in the actual resurrection of Christ, which to the Hebrews would have been physical, goes back to the very beginning. The last thing is when we look at the book of Acts and even Josephus, Tacitus, which are historians, we see how much the early Christians were persecuted. It was not like it is now where there's religious freedom in America. All right, this was an unknown, this was a messianic sect that was seen as very strange. There were many Jews hostile to it. And there were many Greeks and Romans who humiliated it and made fun of it and thought it was weird. All right, so there's persecution that came from the Hebrew front. There's persecution that came from the Roman front, the Gentile front, the colonizer front, so to speak. All right, what does that mean? We can see how much the early Christians suffered, which shows how much they actually believed what they went through. Think about 9/11. This shows in our own contemporary history that when people do crazy things to the point of losing their own life for their religion or ideology, they genuinely believe it. You can see how seriously the earliest Christians took it, and even those who were closest to the movement actually dying, which shows how much the OGs of the whole thing believed it. Men like the Apostle James, the other Apostle James, the brother of Christ, and the James son of Zebedee, both dying in Josephus and the book of Acts. Stephen dying in the book of Acts. The Apostle Peter being martyred, the Apostle Paul being martyred, which comes from early church history. People who were disciples of disciples who would have been in a position to know anyway, corroborating that testimony, seeing it as something to take for granted for the assembly of Christ before we even get into apocryphal stuff. So we have great historical confidence, not only in the suffering of the early Christians, but the Christians who were closest to the actual origin of the movement in Jerusalem. So not only do we have the authenticity of the movement when you look at the Gospels that show that it's not propaganda, because they're doing things that a hostile audience just would have made them more hostile to them. If I'm trying to make up a religion, if I'm trying to be a propagandist, I'm not going to tell you things that's going to make you more hostile to what I'm proclaiming. Because for there even to be a movement, for there to people to believe in, I'm going to need for it to get off the ground first. And I'm not going to do that by telling you things that are going to make you say, my ninja, you're saying women were the ones that saw the Messiah raised. That sounds like cap to me. All right? So we put all these things together, meaning internally speaking, when we look at the full picture, we can clearly see that the apostles legitimately believed Christ raised from the dead. This is something that even skeptics would give you, like Pelagia or Bar Ehrman, who don't believe in the resurrection, would acknowledge that they actually believed it from the very beginning. We're just talking about the belief here. So they believe Christ rose at a moment in time, as the majority of biblical scholars would give us, and the resurrection appearances that the apostles believed. So this is the foundation of the whole thing. They genuinely believed in Christ from the very beginning. So anytime, by the time the Gospels are even being written, for there even to be opportunity to use pagan parallels, they genuinely believed in Christ and his actual resurrection from the get. In other words, the legitimacy of the Jesus movement actually goes all the way back to the Jerusalem by the earliest Christians and the apostles themselves. They genuinely believed in the actual resurrection of Christ in a moment in time. Why is that so important? Because that means any use of pagan parallels or pagan mythology would be a means of trying to reach the Gentile nations to say y'all have this belief, y'all have this motif. We're here to say that it's Christ who is actually the one that fulfills this. Why? Because we know they genuinely believed in him in his original Hebraic context. In other words, the pagan parallels, if they are legitimate, again, I don't think there are any pagan parallels, but I'm saying if there were, there would be a means of extending the message of Christ to the pagan nations when we understand that the root of the belief in Christ goes back to the very beginning in Jerusalem, the capital of the ancient Israelites. In the Second Temple period, the Israelite Hebraic root of all of this is firmly established in 1 Corinthians 15. So if they do use any pagan parallels, that must be factored in and seen from the lens of the actual Christ they originally believed and proclaimed in their original Hebrew culture before Gentiles were ever in the picture. So basically, I got a little picture, a visual framework to help visualize what I'm trying to say. Because I believe that's something that God is doing with me, is the way my mind works, putting things into sort of visual frameworks to better understand what we're talking about. All right? So when it comes to this thing of was Christ based on pagan myths, it's like the initial argument. So this is what the initial argument appears like, all right? He's ripped, he's all dripped out, he looks impeccable, right? Pause. But in terms to show how strong the argument appeals, all right? This is the first appearances, all right? Initial argument, all right? Seems like a steel man, seems like a strong man, seems like this dude knows what he's talking about, right? But when we factor in, I'm gonna get a red marker. What does this mean, y'all? The argument of Christ was based on pagan myths. At first, it seems strong and ironclad, but when we factor in the post-New Testament parallels, the fact that a lot of what is proclaimed by this argument isn't actually found in any ancient source, meaning a lot of it is just bullshit that doesn't actually exist or represent the ancient religion. When we factor in generalizations, again, religion A has miracles, religion B has miracles. That's not enough to say religion A copied B or B copied A. We'd expect different belief systems and spiritual belief systems to have their own miracles. What you gotta do is put them on the scrutiny on a case-by-case basis. And when we factor in correlations, not causation, again, you'd have to prove the apostles and writers of the New Testament in the first century not only knew about these pagan parallels, but they had the intention to use them to advance Christ, which you don't have any evidence for. All right, when you factor in conflating contexts, which I didn't even mention at first, a lot of times people don't recognize that these are different cultures that we're trying to say we're all on the same page, such as a resurrection to an Egyptian meant different than resurrection to an ancient Israelite. All right, it had different connotations. And when we factor in that often a Hebraic root is overlooked, for example, a lot of people look to other religions in the pagan myths when a Hebraic reason is given right in the New Testament. For example, the 12 apostles have a direct connection to the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, so that's a Hebraic root that is often overlooked. When we factor in all of these things, we'll see that this super duper strong man, pause, becomes this weak little boy. Let me get out the way. When we factor in all these various things, all these various principles, and all these various kind of bookends to look at the historical facts through and with, we see this strong man of an argument becomes this weak little unathletic boy over here. So the question is, when we deal with what we're left with, we have to wonder, what an ancient Israelite, and these are braids, by the way. We've talked about how the New Testament better represents the Israelite diaspora than more so than modern Judaism. And the New Testament was written by Israelites, by Jews who believed the Messiah had come and initially wanted that message to reach the other tribes. So the question we have to ask is, when we reduce this to this, would an ancient Israelite, the writer of the New Testament, have had any desire to use a pagan parallel or a pagan motif in the first place? Based on what we looked at, I don't think they did whatsoever. The Jews were very zealous, even prejudiced against other cultures. We see some of these things actually in the New Testament, being as zealous against idolatry and other gods. I don't think we have all the evidence we have points against that direction. I don't think they would have used pagan parallels and interacted with this in any way. But even if they did decide to use pagan parallels, this little weak boy of a remnant, when we factor in what other religions say in contemporary sources, even if they did use any of that stuff, here's a silver bullet. It would be a continuation of what we already see in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And the same with the Old Testament showed that God was really the cry waiter, not Baal. They would be using these pagan parallels and these other cultures to show people who Christ really was. And how do I know that? Because from the very beginning, these Israelites, these followers of Christ, genuinely believed in his resurrection from the very beginning. All right. So what this proves is that, summarized, the argument appears very strong at first. But when we factor in all of these considerations, this strong man, when we're dealing with ancient sources of other religions in the first century, becomes this weak little boy of an argument. This weak little boy of what we're actually dealing with. All right. Because a lot of the parallels are stripped away and destroyed. When we deal with what we're left with, the question is, would the apostles, writers of the New Testament, actually used it? I don't think they would have. But even if they did use that material, it would be an extension of theological messaging, which we already see where the saints repurpose pagan stuff and actually use it to glorify the God of Israel, the God of the Israelites. And why would we know it was that? Because they genuinely believed in Christ within his original Hebraic context. 1 Corinthians 15, Second Temple period, the physical resurrection that ancient Hebrews believed in. They proclaimed this about Christ from the very beginning. So if they do use any motifs, it'd be means of advancing a gospel that they had legitimately believed and had generally proclaimed in Israel from the very beginning.